Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are building on our process. You know that we've, with the 5 areas of the action plan, we've been talking research and education, we've been talking policy development and capacity building. This morning we were looking at specific actions, which is good, and we'll be building on that later and talking about specific stakeholders and monitoring and evaluation of those actions as we flesh out the details of this framework. Next, we're going to be talking stakeholders, and something that's been, something that has come through very, very strongly in the lead up to this whole process. We started with 2 specific regional calls for action to address the major gaps in this area. One is the need for targeted action, and the second is the need for better regional coordination. Given that sport, physical activity and physical education cuts across so many stakeholders, and we can see from our discussions and our dialogue so far how much more potential there is to strengthen these 3 areas through targeted action and better coordination. So with the targeted action, this is how the Pacific SPAPE action plan has come about. Through coordination, we are exemplifying that with the stakeholders that we have here at this forum and the opportunities to harness better coordination. That has, the coordination mechanisms that we have formed with the Regional Task Force and the Regional Reference Group have been a result of extensive stakeholder mapping exercises that have been conducted both nationally and regionally over the last 2 years. So I'm saying that it's not an accident, the types and the representation that we have here in the room at this forum. It's a strategic process, a consultative process that's been happening over a long time. When it comes to those stakeholders and the better coordination, one of the groups that's been, one of the tasks that's been critical to get us to this point is advocacy and policy advocacy and raising sport, physical activity and physical education at the policy table. So it's my pleasure to invite to our panel this morning Mr. Tuala Matthew-Vaea, who's joining us, the CEO of the Samoa Association of Sports and National Olympic Committee. And Matthew brings a wealth of expertise in this area. In the last 4 years, he's been at the microphone advocating for sport in more than 20 countries. Is that fair, Matthew? He is a really powerful spokesperson. He is an athlete, a coach, a leader, a father, and a really strong advocate for sport in the Pacific, and it's a real pleasure to have Matthew here to join us today. So please welcome Matthew. Sit over here. And we also have Ms. Vivian Costa. And Vivian has many hats. Vivian's joining us. She is on the executive board of the Pacific Youth Council. She also has a hat on the executive of Fiji Netball, which she has for many years. She is an auntie to young leaders across the Pacific, and I think knows almost every young and up-and-coming inspiring leader across the Pacific. So Vivian brings a perspective from sport as an administrator here in Fiji, a regional perspective linking youth and policy development, and she's in the middle of doing her PhD here at USP. Still doing her PhD here at USP. But I'm really, really delighted to welcome Vivian to our discussion today. So first, we're going to invite Matthew to give us a perspective on civil society voices for sport from his experience in the last years as a really powerhouse, as a passionate and powerful advocate for sport at the regional level.
Ja, Nisa Mula, Vinakan Talo Falava. Just sitting down yesterday at the opening and reflecting last night, trying to capture some of the key messages. And I thank you to the opening speakers yesterday and the opening panelists, which basically gave us the tone for today. A lot of people in the room sort of asked some questions yesterday. Thank you, Jackie, for that introduction. But what am I doing here? Some of the new faces in the room yesterday during the breaks. So I guess aside from the official intro from Jackie, maybe a little bit overemphasized, but from a sporting perspective, for those who we haven't met officially, I guess coaching is my former background, still is my background, in addition to being an advocate for sports and regionalism and administration. I've been to 5 World Cups, 91, 95, 2011, and 2 World Championships. So Queenie was talking about rugby, the empowerment of women yesterday. I fully resonate with your messages and the change of mindsets. Malo vinaka. I just reflected on the prayer yesterday morning about the spirituality and acceptance, and I just wanted to draw some light on that in terms of the change in the mindsets of the powers of sports. I recall in the World Cup 1991 and 95, when Samoa and Fijians and Tongans approached the powers, as it were, to be able to say a prayer at the beginning or end of the test match, was a no-no. The Sipi Tau, Te Bobo, and the Manu Samoa chant, the Siva Tau, was also a no-no, because we were told that there's only one team in the world that does a cultural challenge, and that was the All Blacks. So we're talking 91, we're talking 95. So witnessing the World Cup, the recent World Cup, how wonderful that mindset has changed of including cultural challenges from the wider global areas of competition. So that's in relevance to what we was talking about yesterday. That's huge. And if you witness, some of you that might have seen 1995, 1999 Rugby World Cups, and also maybe Rugby League and netball, that circle of athletes and bowing is now being officially allowed into that space. So that space being talked about yesterday, it makes total relevance to what we're about in these 2 days. I pick up on the Vice-Chancellor's notes on research and innovation and his key words about not recognizing the hard work done by sports. And I think today and the lead up to today, there's a lot of recognition by donor partners, by government, the private sector, the NGOs and civil society of what sport brings to our development and that national pride, which is totally unmeasured. The Honourable Kuma, Fiji Minister, talked about pathways. He talked about there's a need for more investment in the development of performance levels. Then we heard from Buckley, Honourable Buckley, about the integration of sport into national policy, and I guess we are opening up that can right now, taking it to the next level. She also talked about maybe sport as a tool because it's low cost. And I'd like to see that as a challenge. Why low cost? Maybe with stronger partnerships with the governments and donor partners, we can take away that perceptive and have the same amount of funding that climate change has, and that women empowerment, youth for development, and so forth in ICT. The Honourable Jean-Pierre Nirua yesterday talked about it's everybody's business, sport. But he specifically talked about cross-sectoral engagement and maybe having a shared vision of not just with sports and Ministry of Education and Health, why not bring in other sectors, agriculture, finance, and IT and so forth. So it's having that more global approach. I acknowledge my sister here, Beatrice, for the first panel session yesterday, and that changing of the mindset, acceptance of who we are and what we bring to global development is one message that was clear to me yesterday. We also heard from our friends, our technical expertise, Professor Jito and Dr. Desmond, and they spoke about the swarm of sports. And they talked about human rights, the importance of how to measure our contribution to SDGs, and the toolkit of indicators. So those are some of the things I picked up. But in terms of what the session is about this morning, as Jackie alluded to, 4 years in the making, 2016, sport came into this space, and it was engagement and lobbying through the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, the national levels of governments and the civil societies and private sector, can we get acceptance? What does that look like? Well, here it is. Topical from 2016. This is what we were told. Sports coming into the space of civil society with human rights. We talk about the West Papua issues. We talk about a lot of issues in our oceans. And then sports walks into the room. And I remember walking into GBH during the Olympics 2016, and everybody looked at me and said, "What are you doing in this room? What is sport doing in this room?" So that was the attitude. And then having sort of digested some of these leading thematic areas and topics from the lead, from Penisoni, from Dame Meg Taylor, sort of finally we sort of got a grip of, this is about the framework of Pacific regionalism. And what is it? And then the theme, recognizing and engaging civil society, which sport is part of, and what it brings to the region. That last one, and I guess we talked a lot in the last session about financing for development solutions, was also a very clear message that came out. Just this morning, we're going to be sharing a lot of this presentation, just sharing with my colleague Vivian, because she has been part of the journey at the regional and global level. First thing that we needed to do was capacity building of NSAs. So there was about 25 to 30 people that were selected from around the region, nominated through their organizations due to their professional profiles, as you can see. Landscape pathway, and then the capacity building through Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and also EU, who funded that process for about 12 months. Question was, what did you get help on? So some of the things like advocacy, influencing through connectivity of the sports fraternity, connecting to leaders, connecting to your global networks. How can you bring that in and let Forum Secretariat put you in the right direction? So those are some of the platforms that we went through. And there was a need to engage with governments at the right platforms, with private sector and also civil society. So if you can imagine, this is 2016, right at the edge of negotiating who was going to represent civil society to Pompeii, the leaders meeting in Federated States of Micronesia. Everything stopped. Fiji was just knocked out. The other finalists, England, in the sevens competition. So for 2 hours we were at the TV with MLA. You all know who MLA is, the leader of Piango, as it were, celebrating Fiji's win at the Olympics 2016. But the funny thing is, after getting the noise that they don't accept sports in the civil society, we went back into the room. The whole tone changed. So the gold medal for Fiji in 2016, that was the catalyst, one of the catalysts of getting acceptance, because the whole nation stopped. The whole global movement of sports, private sector, call it however you want, stopped because of what Fiji did to Pacific Island sports through rugby. They told us that the sport comes across as a cross-cutting issue right across the strategic agenda for the Pacific and also for the globe. In the negotiation of key issues to be taken to the leaders' meeting, or Troika, in Pompeii, that these were the 5 recommendations or priorities that were agreed with the many, many stakeholders of civil society at GPH and 1 or 2 sports representation in the room. Gender equity, equality, peace and security, ICT, youth development, and here we go, sport for development and peace. At the seating at Pompeii with the 3, or the Troika, Papua New Guinea, the Prime Ministers, Samoa, Federated States of Micronesia, their message was, we see it. Sports contribution to society is well recognized by our leaders. At the end of that leaders meeting, we were looking for a stronger statement that represented these issues. When the communique came out, I think we had less than a sentence. And it didn't quite reflect some of these things here, which told me and my colleagues who were there, you still needed to carry on the fight. Keep fighting for that space, advocacy, connectivity, and a little bit of influence. Sure, sorry. So, What does that journey look like since 2016? I'm going to ask Vivian to join me along this journey in terms of what this morning is about, advocacy and communication, and the journey through the civil society or non-state actors, because that is the official platform that helps sports get to foreign economic ministers, ministries of education, health, and donor partners. This has been the journey. Vivian, would you like to come up? So 216, the acronyms, I think most of us understand what they stand for. PIFS, Forum Secretariat. The training and policy engagement, that took about a year, 12 months of regular training in the region, how to prep ourselves to have the right language. And that was a huge challenge, bringing sports language into this platform where it's political and maybe strategic language. We had to embrace that in order to prepare ourselves for 2017. The CSO, Civil Society Organizations Forum, where they come together and negotiate priority issues. And you're fighting with human rights. You're fighting with seabed mining. You're fighting with West Papua. You're fighting with ICT to get in that room, to get in that space, to get up to the ministerial level. And Vivian can elaborate a little bit more on that. Vivian, would you like to speak about those CSO forums, please?
Absolutely. So the question Matt posed earlier, what are you doing in this room, when he was at the GPH? And that's a question the CSO space asked, because it's a highly contested space. You're fighting for so many things, not just policy, not just recognition, you're also fighting for funding opportunities. So when you're in that space, you're strategic and you're targeted. And in comes this group that the perception is sports has IOC, so they have all this money, why are they here? And also perception that, well, sports, well, okay, go and compete. Why are you here? And so really just making the connection between sport, well, taking it away just from sport, but also physical activity. So when CSOs start talking about NCDs, that the connection needs to be made. And sometimes it needs to be as plain and basic as that. But it is a highly contested space. The questions do get asked. But it also means that you, which Matt just alluded to, it means that you need to do your homework and you need to be absolutely prepared when you're in the room. And this comes down to the communique component. Even before you get to the communique, just doing the CSO dialogue itself, in the forum, getting yourself into what the CSO statement is going to look like. So that's a negotiated and navigated space. But if you come in prepared with as little opportunity for anyone to edit you out, then you're likely to be in there. And it's just I think some of the tricks of the trade that we've learned in our being in that space.
Those are some of the positive challenges, because I say positive because we've managed to influence some decision makers, and I go back to connectivity of sports, linking to your ministers if you can, using that sporting events or the cocktail, the odd trip to maybe to some forums outside sports to influence them on what is coming up at the regional level. And going through this journey, if you look at 217, after Pompeii in 2016, Piango, the AGA, the Annual General Assembly, it was the first time sport had been invited by the Pacific Island Association of Non-Government Organizations. Himalaya said to me after Pompeii, Matt, can you come and speak to NGOs about the role of sport and development? And here I am. I've hardly gone through any training. I'm learning about new language. I don't have any political associations, and I'm expected to speak to this regional body. So those were some of the challenges, the learnings, and then we moved into 217. Highlighted there is FEM, the Forum of Economic Ministers meeting, as Vivian shared. CSO Forum determines the priority issues that is brought in by civil society, of which sport is part of. Fortunately, we were able to articulate a lot of our priorities from the previous year, which the ministers of Forum Economic Ministers, their response was, and I guess it really relates to where we are today, is go back, bring us quantified evidence that is measured in 12 months, bring it back to Palau 218, and then we'll talk. So that's research. Go and find your own money, bring measured outcomes, and do a couple of case studies on Samoa and Fiji. So again, the linkages is there. So that's how that came about. The team, obviously Jackie here, Dr. Mosa, and a lot of the stakeholders here in the region, Fiji as a hub, then went to work. We secured 200,000 Fijian dollars. As you see in the research that was given, the report yesterday, 50 from Samoa, and the other 350s from ONOC, Youth and Sports here, and also University of South Pacific. That enabled sports to go back and do the homework. Then came the Pacific Update Conference. I was invited by the Forum Secretariat to share with the Secretary General and the Deputy SG to donor partners, EU, UNESCO, UNICEF, about where sports was traveling. And if you look at the next line where the Black Kazan Action Plan was, we knew we were heading to Kazan in Russia. So we had to be very open about what we were taking to Russia in terms of priorities as a region. And that was another learning stage for myself, but also for representing the group in terms of trying to articulate to donor partners where we need the most help and investment. Obviously, research was part of it, and more engagement at the critical level of decision makers. Kazan Action Plan, we've seen the 3 priorities. It becomes like a monotone now. It's automated in a lot of our memory banks in terms of coming away from Russia on those 3 key priority areas: access for all, maximizing the contribution, and protecting the integrity of sport. The Pacific Forum Leaders Meeting, second Leaders Meeting in Samoa, and again, Vivian and I were part of that build-up, again, fighting with civil society, even more of a fight a year later, about getting the priorities for sports. Oceans became very important, protecting our blue continent, so there was a lot of fight to get that space, and sport was getting a little bit pushed out. Anyhow, we managed to get our priorities in, and I became an observer and a mentor for speakers who represented sport and civil society priorities in Samoa. The next acronym, the Pacific Sports Ministerial Meeting in Vanuatu, we have the Honourable Minister here who witnessed that and drove the cross-sectoral approach that sport is everybody's business. The roundtable that happened the day before, coordinated by Jackie, and then the ministerial meeting, which really, that is where a lot of outcomes we see today were born from in terms of getting it to the next level, getting it to the ministerial level and our leaders. Vivian, anything to add at this stage?
I want to take us back just a little bit to FEM 2017, which is the Forum Economic Ministers meeting. This was the first time that the CSOs were invited to dialogue with the Forum Economic Ministers. And so being in the room was very important. Now, Matt mentioned something about training to be in these spaces. We don't just rock up and, fly by the seat of your pants and hope you've got it right. But the non-state actors unit at PIFS actually held training for the dialogue. There were 5 CSOs that presented themselves for that training. Sports was one. I was part of the PYC, so the youth development was the other. Piango, I think the Tonga Trade Union, and one other I can't remember. And the fact that only 5 out of all of the CSOs in the entire region turned up for that training meant that both sports and youth have an understanding of how FEM works. And what we need to do in order to make that an effective dialogue. And we've actually seen that in both instances, that when we've gone into FEM, we've been prepared, we've followed their instructions to have research, to, very importantly, come with a solutions-based query if you have one. Don't simply come and talk about all the problems and that you need to do something. Government has 10,000 other things that they need to do. So having a solutions-based approach, in some instances, certainly in the youth economic empowerment component, making suggestions, but also just recognizing that maybe we could do this thing and just letting you know that as economic ministers, this is what we're going to do. So in terms of youth, we worked with ILO, and we have worked with ILO since 2009. From FEM 2017, we were able to establish a relationship between Forum Secretariat and ILO. through a youth employment program. So again, that training was so important because it gave us some insight into how to work this space. And it really is, it's working the space. And it also means then that for every FEM afterwards, youth and sport, the two buddies in every ministry around the region, youth and sport were very well prepared and were reporting on things that we had done the year before. And that, I think also that's another point, is that there's many things we could talk about, but the economic ministers, for example, like the leaders, have had to listen to even more. And so just sticking in your lane, basically, and just driving that point home, it then becomes a norm to hear something from youth, to hear something from sport, but something new. And so I just wanted to go back to that. And this is an experience we've had not just in the FEM space, but also with the leaders meeting. And certainly with CSOs, because we can say, well, you know, we understand FEM, we were there at the training. You can hold it over a few people's heads. And it does mean then that they are more likely to listen to your guidance. One of the things, if I might share, Matt, one of the things from this year's CSO forum is someone came up to me and said, I finally understand why you go to FEM. And so for this year, youth did not go to the leaders meeting in terms of a statement. We had our priority was economic ministers, and we got that. And you know, economic ministers are the money people. So they're the most important ministry in terms of all of government because they decide where the money is going. So yes, we made that conscious decision. We're not going to the leaders. We need FEM. And the CSO forum said, okay, yeah, we understand. That's where you guys go anyway with sport. And so yes, again, the training is important. And once Matt's finished, I also want to just raise a few other points.
Thank you, Vivian. And just in sharing, to arrive at a statement, sitting as the chair at FEM with private sector and all the ministers of the Pacific, to arrive at a 4-line paragraph probably took 3 months, because in the negotiation of that wording from all the civil society people, and I know Honourable Minister understand as well, not easy. So your statement at the beginning of March totally changes at mid-April because of the fighting for that space of how to reword it, and more importantly, how to link it to other priorities, women empowerment, ICT, youth, development and so forth, and absolutely as Vivian has shared. Kazan, the leaders in Samoa, that was very contested if you were there. I'm not sure whether some of you were there. The Aggie Greys, there were 2 rooms. One was for civil society. It was packed out, regional media, global media. Couldn't get everybody in the room. Media had to be left out and in. And then private sector, an hour and a half later, in the same, or the room next door, virtually half empty. So the attention on civil society and the engagement with leaders was building in those years. Then came again, as Vivian shared, the CSO forum, the initial build-up. What are your priorities now, given that NCDs, the Blue Pacific, and financing climate action became more of a priority in 2018? So again, we knew where we were going. We needed to bring evidence from the 2017 FEM to the 2018 in Palau. Research, and to touch on SPAPE as we are today. So there we presented the preliminary findings of the research as shared by our colleagues yesterday to all the Pacific Island ministers. It was chaired by the Minister of Finance from Samoa, Sili Epatuyoti. Fortunately, I'd had some time in Samoa to brief him. Again, connect with him, have a beer with him, buy him lunch, and tell him what was coming in Palau a few months ahead. Not to influence, not to affect any sort of integrity, but to voice the priorities by sports. By the time we got to Palau, and by the time I'd finished my presentation, private sector, or PIPSO, presented before FEM. And the responses from the ministers after both presentations were, PIPSO and private sector, you told us about your blue pearls in Cook Islands, excuse my friend, and around the region, all the gold, all the money that you have, but there's no evidence. You have not brought evidence to this forum in terms of what is the contribution of private sector to some of the regional priorities. There was only one question that was raised by the Minister of Australia, which I responded to in terms of the PSP program. But the overall consensus and the response from the chair was, we asked you to do this 12 months ago. We asked you to bring quantifiable evidence, real data. You have done that. You have gone and built stakeholders. You've built your partnerships with your 200,000. Let's take it to the next step. And they endorsed that ahead of the leaders' meeting in Nauru, which is the next black writing you see. In between there, CGF, Commonwealth Games Federation, was invited with Kathy Wong to be observers at the General Assembly, but also a chance to advocate through ministers and the wider Commonwealth fraternity about where Pacific sports priorities were coming from. First time, once again. PIF's leaders meeting, 2018. Now SPAPE was starting to make some noise. Research endorsed by the ministers. Vivian and I were there. We sat with the ministers. We negotiated our issues throughout the first half of the year. And they were, I guess, 100% endorsed by the prime ministers after the private sector. Then came Samoa, all the lead up with the research, Jackie and the team, and the technical expertise in terms of building up to the Pacific Games, collecting the evidence of every tālā spent in Samoa from an economic and social cohesion perspective. Stephen's in the room. You were part of that. But what came out of that, in my own mind, were stronger relationships. Maybe not formal partnerships on paper, but we were having real conversation with MOF, and we have our colleague here from Ministry of Finance, Veti from Samoa. We were having real conversation with MESC, Education, Sport and Culture, MFAT, Foreign Affairs and Trade, SIFA, International Finance in Samoa, and Central Bank. So all of a sudden, sports, or the advocates, were being invited to these decision-making processes to create more awareness and to also lobby the priorities for sports. And then 2019, and I'll hand it over to Vivian. I know you've been part of those first three, PIFS, CSO, FEM in Suva, more negotiation, and then the leaders before I close off on the Miracle Games.
And as I said earlier, when you go into the room, even at the CSO level, to say, this is what we want, it's already worded. You can't play around with it. And then through the 3 months, you haven't really done anything. You haven't really done anything, maybe added a comma somewhere. But also just, and this is just a personal observation, one of the things I've seen, because I've been in these processes, is that you have to be in the room. And when you are in the room, they start talking about, oh yes, so youth, when we do this, we need to have that youth perspective, which is the purpose, my purpose for being in the room anyway. But I've also noticed that sport is also now part of the conversation. That if you're not in the room, you're not going to be part of the conversation. But when you're there and part of the conversation, but also very deliberate conversation, then people are going to remember you. They're going to remember your area of work. They're going to remember something that you've suggested the year before, and so on and so forth. So in terms of advocacy and being in these spaces, you have to physically be in the room to have that discussion. And also, you have to have the discussion. It's one thing to be in the room and not say anything at all. But in the CSO forum space and in the FEM space, again, youth, sorry, mixing my two areas. Sports reported to CSOs, and also said, we want to go to FEM, as did youth. Now, I was asked to talk on sport at the FEM meeting, and it really was to just say, thank you very much for your support. Yes, we are conducting the research in Samoa, and of course the minister from Samoa was there, and he was, set up a little bit taller because he knew that was his process. But that also became important, and so ministers around the room who had seen us the year before, and had heard Matt the year before, were like, oh yes, they're continuing with what they said they were going to do. And so again, if you're going to go into the room, you go in with purpose, you go in with a solutions-based component, and then you report and say, you know what, we did our work. It's also harder for ministers and leaders to say, well, you haven't done anything when you have the proof. The other thing, too, I wanted to mention is that sport is led by example with the CSO community in terms of the research. So when we were in Palau and noticed and experienced the good reception to the research from the ministers and also from DFAT and MFAT and all of the other fats, when that happened, they're the money people, so for us. But when that happened, the CSO movement said, well, oh, wow, they're onto something. We now need to now do our own stuff. And so in FEM 2019, there was reference to, we want to do research on the oceans, that we want a moratorium. We actually call for a moratorium on mining of the oceans, particularly when it's the decade of the oceans from next year. And let's just do more research so that we know more rather than guess what's happening. And that came from the CSO forum. And about a month later, Fiji government announced the moratorium for Fiji. And again, it's about just finding out more things. They're going to do it anyway. But we're saying, look, let's just figure out what's our risk assessment of this, our true risk assessment. So CSOs then learning from sport, saying, look at the reception that they received, we need to go down this path. And not just on that note, that's what youth are doing anyway, going down the same path. So.
Fantastic, David. I know Stephen's in the room talking about the miracle games, Samoa, the research, but more specifically the activation leading on from what happened at the end of 2018. And so, I mean, one of the partners that's not on there that were very, very helpful is the Bureau of Statistics, who helped inform how to collect data and so forth. I'm not an expert in that area, but highlighting some of those relationships that now exist and will help us strengthen our case going forward. Where is this going in terms of the continuity? And then the last two, the roundtable at the Pacific Sports Ministers meeting. Honourable Minister was there in terms of totally endorsing the research findings, but also looking ahead to what research finding this group will bring at the end of 2019. There's also a cry out, there was a call out, which I'll address in the next slide, in terms of continuity of this type of work through sports in the region. So, outcomes. So where are we after that journey? And just talking to Vivian this morning, we have very strong voice in the civil society forums on an annual basis, if not more. We have good relationships and a very strong presence with the economic ministers. The Pacific Island leaders' endorsement of SPAPE action plan speaks volumes for where sport is going as an outcome. Sports Minister's strong support for SPAPE's policy engagement and that research capacity in the long term. The Council of Pacific Games endorsement and that call out. The call out to sports to look at providing continuity in the next 8 years, perhaps with a budget line through the Pacific Games Council in planning ahead for Solomon Islands and beyond, to further inform governments and other sectors on better resource planning. And I think stronger recognition has come through the many relationships and leaders in the region and globally. And also, sport has a lot to learn from these engagements, and I think a bit more fluid understanding by sports of linking to national developments, because we tend to work in our silos. We just talk about the All Blacks, Samoa, Fiji, but what about the bigger picture? What about the issues of your own country? What does a national strategic plan look like? So through that process, we're getting a bit more fluid in understanding what policy development and the priorities are for our countries. Future, I don't think that statement from 2016 has changed much in investing in innovative regional policy and measurement framework. We're bringing the evidence, but also the return on investment, which no doubt we'll hear from later on this year from the research. Relevancy of the research. We talked about this yesterday. We're in the space of employment opportunity for Pacific Island professionals, students. We just talked about that with Jeremy earlier. Great opportunity. And the sustainable growth, the continuity as an enabler of that sustainable development, not only Agenda 230, but I use the Samoa 240 plan, which my colleague Betty knows more about, looking well and beyond the global priorities. Been asked as part of this presentation to maybe give some thought about this body, this forum, in terms of the design and some actions. I believe maybe an annual policy and research forum update can be held, either here in Fiji or right at the hub of where the technical work has been done. That's an open question. And then attached to that, secure financing partners through the Pacific Games Council for the long-term continuity of this work. Continuity in policy dialogue through Forum Secretariat, a great partner. And then perhaps, as Honourable Minister talked about, sport is everybody's business. We're not in silos to advocate for the inclusion so that we're in health, we're in education, we're in horticulture and other forums so that we have the global reach in terms of linking and adding value to our priorities. The last one is determine when are we going to have the research symposium date this year, the results from Pacific Games. I leave you with not a funny story, but that sort of depicts 4 years of work at the Nauru leaders meeting and the press conference on your right in terms of people who have influence, who have embraced the journey by sport. Leader of the Forum Leaders, Tulepa, and also Dame Meg Taylor, who has been inspirational and very strategic in getting sports on the regional and global agenda. I hope we've added value. Thank you.
And this is a very interesting picture because allies are so important. And you need allies from the CSO community, because especially if you're the only voice of sports in that space. We use the big conference room at PIFS, which can fit, I don't know how many hundreds. That's where the CSO forum is held. And so when you need to voice sport, you're voicing it against at least 100 other people with 100 other issues. And so you do need some allies in the room. And again, being in the space, continually being in the space, and they're like, hey, sport, come here, to Matt. Come here and tell us what's happening here. Or in my case, I'm the youth person. Yeah? So that's important. You need the CSO allies. You also need the government allies. The economic minister from Samoa is definitely a sport ally. We're slowly bringing him over to the youth component. Certainly the prime minister is an ally. PIFs have allies, excuse me. Dame Meg as an ally. And again, I can see a parallel with youth. We were at the Pacific Oceans Alliance meeting, and she made an intervention about youth. So she stopped the entire meeting to just remind people what young people say when we talk about traditional knowledge and culture. And for me, sitting in the room, I wanted to get up and just do a little bit of a dance, because the Secretary General of the organization and the Oceans Commissioner remembered something that we've just continually said. And that brings me to my next point. Sport has an in, because you have an action plan. Yeah? It's there, and that you have to report on that action plan. What you're doing, where you've gotten to, all of that. So you have an in, but don't be complacent about it. And it's quite easy to be complacent. And then people, it's like, oh yeah, it's those sport people again. That's not, what are they saying? And then you sort of do some other work, yeah? So again, be in the space, don't be complacent. Always bring something, even if it's just one thing, bring it to say, you know what, we haven't forgotten, we're going to keep you on your toes too. All right, that's all. Thank you.
It's not all. Ooh.
That was the loudest the microphone.
It's not all. It's not all. This session's still continuing. And one thing that's also been added to this CSO engagement in the policy space related to sport, physical activity, and physical education is the voices of athletes. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the panel Mr. Carl Probert. Come on down, Carl. Carl Probert is a legendary swimmer in Fiji, but he's also a leader in sports. He's on the board of the World Olympians Association. He is on the Whasanok Athletes Commission, the Whasanok Olympics Association, on the executive of Fiji Surfing. He could even be the president of Fiji Surfing, in fact, and a number of many other hats. Welcome, Carl. We're really happy to have you here today. And just linking to the dialogue that we've just heard about the spaces for civil society to influence regional policy dialogue, and Vivian and Matt have been talking about the regional civil society forums. We made sure, and we're talking, remember at the beginning of the session we mentioned that representation is really important, and the people that we have in this room is a representation of regional organisations and regional structures. We introduced in our sport representatives at that regional civil society forum the voices of athletes, and made sure that we were making applications for representative voices from athletes from the ONOC Athletes Commission. So last year we had Ryan Pinney, who spoke yesterday in the opening session. So he was advocating at the Forum Secretariat last year. So he was videoed by Forum Secretariat speaking about the need for stronger sport policy in the region. So these messages are tying in together, and I really welcome Carl to our panel to share his perspective with us on the power that athletes bring to the advocacy table. Vinaka Carl.
Thank you, Jackie. Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so I guess I'm just here just to remind or ask everybody not to forget that there's a really valuable resource that I think everybody does have in the athletes in their various countries. We have a lot to contribute. We're getting a lot more organized. For example, we do have the ONOC Athletes Commission. We are setting up athletes commissions in all of the various countries, and all of those commissions have their own goals to improve communication through sport, up and down through the organization, but also to deliver on programs. There's a lot of funding through the IOC and various other bodies that the athletes do programs through. So it's a huge resource, and I think that in some respects, there's some of the goals that everybody's trying to achieve. In some ways, athletes can actually drive some of those goals. I'd say, for example, in research and data collection, I think one of the things that we've identified is that there's a real lack of real data and resource on development of athletes in all of the countries, identifying talent and seeing them progress up to the elite level. So I mean, even from the athletes commissions, we realize this. So we're trying to drive that sort of data gathering, and I'm sure that's really valuable for all the tools that you guys are talking about as well. Another area that we're really trying to accelerate is in the safeguarding of athletes. So I imagine that's part of the child protection policy, because we have queries, we have a lot of issues and discussions around athletes when they try to qualify for games, how they train, etc. So these, I think, can really accelerate any of the goals that you're looking for child protection. And overall, the Voice of the Athletes program is set up to deliver messages. So athletes are a real valuable tool for engagement to advocate for all the types of messages that you're trying to do, and I think would be quite effective if we start to get some information on it, deliver messages about healthy lifestyle, the environment, all of those types of messages that we try and promote. And I guess the final sort of points that I'd like to raise is that, you know, if we can stay involved, not just during the big meetings, but if we can have athlete representation right through all of this dialogue, I think it'll be a lot more valuable. So thank you for having me on the panel, and just realize the resource that you guys all do have. Thank you.
I just wanted to share something Carl said. The optics of the champion. So when we walked into the CSO forum last year and Ryan Peeney's sitting there, and everyone calls him by his full name because that's how we've heard it, it's like, that's Ryan Peeney from Papua New Guinea, that gold medalist, so on and so forth. We have to take a picture of him. So no matter how hardened a CSO advocate you are, you're also a fan. And so I think that that's also an important component, because when Ryan speaks, everyone wants to listen to Ryan Peeney, the athlete, but also, okay, what is this guy saying? What does he have to say, and how do we take what he has to say and add it to what we're doing? And so even at its most basic form, a champion in their own right is in the room that people are willing to listen to. And so I think that's an important point about athlete representation.
Okay, we have a unique opportunity here that we have government minister representation with the Honourable Jean-Pierre Nirua here, Minister of Education and Training in Vanuatu. We also have a number of senior officials from various different ministries here. So this is a nice opportunity for us in a closed forum to be having some dialogue and learning about how we can best use the tools that we have and navigate the policy space going forward. So I'd just like to invite a comment from Honourable Minister Nirua, particularly as it relates to education, because we've got a number of actions and a number of interventions that we're planning to make in the physical education space, and maybe we can get some advice on the best way that we as a collective group can support you in that advocacy.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. First of all, let me also commend the three speakers for a very wonderful presentation, combined presentation that they made. I think they have, in the slide that we went through, it has already pointed some good sense of direction of where to go to if you want to get the attention of the audience that you're looking for. As far as ministers of education are concerned, there are, from this, the current forum that we're having, two avenues I can think of. Either we go through, and it is good that USP is now coordinating these meetings. Either we go through the USP Council, where all the ministers of education sit. The limitation with the USP Council is that it only groups 12 education ministers. The other avenue would be the Forum Education Ministers meeting that has a wider representation. For example, in USP Council, we do not have Papua New Guinea, we do not have New Zealand. We have representatives, but not at ministerial level. And Palau, for example, I don't think they are in the USP Council. So my personal recommendation was for us maybe to try and explore the possibility of carrying a voice, the voice of this forum and all the good things that are happening around this forum, probably through the Forum Education Ministers meeting. You know, the Forum Education Ministers meet every 2 years under the auspices of PIFs, and the meetings are normally held back-to-back with the USP Council, where you have already all the ministers from USP, and then coupled with maybe some representation from non-USP members. But in order to get a bigger impact, education ministers meeting at the forum level are more like a consultative group. They don't have any avenue to influence any decision or to be making any decisions. So we have to further channel our own voices and concerns through existing mechanisms, decision-making mechanisms of the forum. One useful one is the FEM, which CSO, whom I congratulate, have successfully used. I use also an example of the, yesterday during the statement I made a reference to the a conference that was held 1.5 weeks ago in Nandi. This is about early childhood development. Early childhood development is really talking about the development of the child, the first 1,000 days of the development of the child. This is from conception to 2 or 3 years. This is something, strictly speaking, that falls outside of the responsibility of the ministries of education. In our country, in Vanuatu, for example, we intervene in children's education when they are age 4 and 5. That's where they go to kindergarten, and we take on. So what happens before then, again, it's another everyone's business. But the key ministries to that conference are Ministries of Finance, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Justice, Ministry of Education. We can also add Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Transport, Ministry, all the other ministries, and all the other, another everyone's business. So in the deliberation we had, we decided in creating the regional council, ECD council, to channel all our priority areas through FEM. So my suggestion here would be to contemplate if you want to use an avenue to go through bigger audiences and especially approach a bigger audience is probably to go through the Ministers of Education, PIF Ministers Forum Education Ministers meeting, and then through them go through FEM to carry our voice. The good thing is that at least a successful president has been set, and my proposal will be to use that avenue, but making sure that we expand the audience, more people to carry this message through FEM, through education ministers. And I'm not aware of the other, of course there are health ministers, there are other ministers involved, but from the education ministry's perspective, this is something I would like to suggest for us to carry our voice, the voice and all the good work that you are doing here to higher instances. Thank you very much.
Just one further question from my side in how specifically we can better support you in terms of the physical education message. When you get to the meeting, and we heard reference before about months of dialogue being condensed down to one paragraph or one sentence in an outcome document, what can we prepare to put into your hands to take to the meeting?
I don't know what you want to prepare. Let the outcome of this meeting determine what you want to, what message to carry. But the reality is that whatever amount of work is put, we may produce a page or 2 or 3 or 4. So long as you capture a sentence of a paragraph, and that's it, you are in. Yes. So really, I would leave that to the meeting to determine what kind of important message we want to carry forward. But the reality is that, as our colleagues have mentioned, there are so many competing priorities, and so long as you use the right channel and the good people to present this. One advantage of this is that FEM is meeting, I don't know when next time, you might know, March next year, but the Pacific Island Forum leaders meeting will be held in Vanuatu. That's the good news. So spiritually, I can support you in whatever way. The good and bad news is that I might not be re-elected because we're having elections in March. But we're in the Pacific, this is the reality. But whether I'm a minister or as Jean-Pierre Niro or simply, of course, I'm willing to do whatever I can with my colleagues to make sure that we carry this message across. Thank you.
If only we all had a vote in this room.
I just wanted to share that, yes, it's difficult to put a sentence together, but a CSO dialogue statement is a maximum of 2 pages. So oceans, climate change, youth, sport, all of it is in 2 pages. And it really comes down to an exercise in English language proficiency. That's what it is. And so if the better you are at it, the more likely you're going to have it in there. But that really just, and the reason for that is that the ministers have a lot to read. And so they don't have much time. The dialogue is 2 hours in total. And so, again, it's a 2-pager that you're dealing with. And we have had the experience where private sector has done more, And that's when you see ministers have a chat with each other. They go out to, 5 toilet breaks in that span of time. And again, so it's 2 pages. You have to be as concise as possible.
So our topic today is advocacy and communication here, and this is one of the pillars of our regional action plan. And remember, we were making the distinction yesterday that this is not a sport policy area, this is an area of regional significance where we can collectively come together and influence change towards our desired outcome. So when it comes to advocacy and communication, we need to be really clear about who we're advocating to, what we're advocating for, and how we're going to do that. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. We've heard some about having engagement, direct engagement at high-level meetings. There are different spaces. The word spaces has been used a lot in this conversation. And there are even further descriptions of that. There's open spaces, like an open forum where anybody can go. There are closed spaces, like the forum leaders meeting, where we're not allowed to sit in the room, we're not allowed to be at the table. There are invited spaces, like the CSO dialogue, where specific representatives, in very strict conditions, are invited to the table and may or may not have an opportunity to speak at different times. And then there are created spaces. This is an example of a created space, because this hasn't happened before. The policy forums that we've hosted in Vanuatu in 2017 and this year in Samoa is a created space where we made a space for civil society, for ministers and officials to come together, and that has directly influenced the content and the outcomes and the communique of the sports ministers' meetings, for example. When we're talking about the action plan, let's come back to the areas that we've been discussing today. We've got leisure, recreation, participation and pathways, physical education, people and capability, sports tourism, climate action and sustainability. On the other side of the board, we've got high performance, integrity and human rights. I'd like us to consider now who we need to be advocating to and what we might be advocating for in our communication strategy. We've had some conversations already about NCDs and the need to get more Pacific Islanders moving more often. How are we going to do that? Who does that message need to go to? And what tools are we going to use to do it? Is that a place for athlete advocacy? Climate action. We want to influence behaviour change. We want to see people stop throwing plastics into our oceans. How are we going to influence that? Who's going to do it? This is a part of our advocacy and communications. Decision making and policy. We've got representation on our regional task force from ministers of sport, ministers of health, ministers of finance, ministers of education. But we've got a lot of other key stakeholders. How are we going to choose the best strategy to influence the agenda and the specific actions that we prioritise in this action plan? So in front of you, you have a handout from our last couple of years of consultations, both nationally and regionally. These are some of the stakeholders that this has been added to over time. So this is a snapshot loosely sitting around a board table. At the top there, because we're focusing at the regional level, I've put that at the top of the page, the regional stakeholders. And from those regional stakeholders, most of those groups have representation here at the forum or were invited to attend the forum. At the national level, we're talking about a similar set of stakeholders or the members of those regional organisations plus more. When we add, for example, insurance companies and school sport and parents and P&C associations and things like that. So for today, let's look at the regional stakeholders. The first challenge in your tables is, can you please test the stakeholders that are listed there, regionally and nationally, and see if we need to add or change what's captured on that list. And then we're going to do an exercise around power and influence. Please, and please thank our panelists.